On May 20th, 1967, 51-year-old Steve Mikulik returned home from Falcon Lake without the left side of his shirt. It had burned off. On his chest was a mesh-like grid of burn holes consisting of 27 holes, exactly 9 by 3, each 1.5 centimeters in diameter, arranged with mechanical precision. But that wasn't even the strangest part. The strangest thing was that the Canadian military doctors who examined him 2 days later in Winnipeg found an object in his rectum that could not be removed, identified, or explained to anyone, neither in Canada nor in the United States to this day. Stefan Michalek was born in 1916 in Poland, in a small industrial town west of Warsaw. In the 1940s, fleeing the war, he made his way first to Germany, then to Great Britain, and in 1904, in 1954, he emigrated to Canada. He settled in Winnipeg, in the province of Manitoba, and found work as a machinist at the David Newberry Limited factory, where he worked with precision metal parts, drilling, cutting, and polishing. He lived in an ordinary 2-story house on Dorchester Street with his wife Maria and their 3 children. On Sundays, he attended a Polish Catholic church. He read books on geology. He collected journals at the library about pegmatite veins and ore outcrops in the Canadian Shield. Geology was his passion, not a profession, but something more than a hobby. On weekends, he would take his old green 1959 Ford Fairlane and drive north of the city, to the lakes, to outcrops of pink Precambrian granite, to shores where, in the cracks of the Canadian Shield, one could find pegmatite veins with inclusions of feldspar and mica, and sometimes traces of ore mineralization, which in these parts meant one of 2 things, either nickel or silver. He knew Falcon Lake well. He went there several times a year, wandered along the coastal cliffs with a hammer and a bag, breaking pieces of gray granite in search of that characteristic sheen. His wife said this was his substitute for fishing. On Friday, May 19, 1967, Michalek packed his backpack in advance. He put a notebook with pencils, a hammer and chisel, a thermos of coffee, 2 ham sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, a German-made Sunto compass he'd bought back in Europe, and an old canvas hat inside. He started the car at 6 in the morning on Saturday, May 20th. From Winnipeg to Falcon Lake is about 120 kilometers east on Highway 1 and then north. The drive took him just under 2 hours. He made one stop at a gas station in Whitemount, a wooden canopy, 2 pumps, a faded Shell sign on a pole. It smelled of leaded gasoline and pine needles. That scent, sharp and resinous at the same time, was inseparable from the Manitoba Highway in late May. He drank a glass of orange juice from a vending machine and asked the attendant how the weather was. "It'll be nice," the man said. He parked the car in the lot at the entrance to the restricted area of Falcon Lake Provincial Park and set off on foot toward the southeast, toward the rocky ridge along the shore, to the spot where he'd found a promising pegmatite outcrop with pink feldspar last time. It was around 9 in the morning. The sky was clear, that early blue color that only appears in late May in Manitoba, when the cold hasn't quite left yet, but the smell of melting snow has already given way to the scent of the earth. No one was around. The forest consisted of pine and white birch, a silence in which every step could be heard. Around 10:30 a.m., Michalek approached an open stone plateau, about 60 by 40 meters, almost perfectly horizontal, covered with gray lichen. He stopped at the edge, took out his notebook, and jotted down a geological note about the nature of the rock. Then he looked up. To the northwest, above the forest, at a height of about 40 meters, 2 objects were hovering, glowing, oblong and disc-shaped. They were moving from the horizon toward the plateau, silently, descending gradually. The first thought Michalek managed to jot down in his notebook was, "Experimental American aircraft?" He put on his welder's goggles. They were in his pocket. He'd taken them out to better see the glint in the rock under the sun. And he began to watch. The first craft, larger in size, with a diameter, by his estimate, of about 12 meters, hovered at a height of about 8 meters, and, after a few seconds, began to descend slowly. The second one, slightly smaller, hovered higher up, then abruptly changed its angle of descent and vanished over the horizon. Quickly, so quickly that McCalloch didn't even have time to turn his head to watch it go. It was just there, and then it was gone. The first craft continued to descend. It landed, literally landed, just as an airplane touches down, softly, almost silently, with only a faint whistling of air, on a rocky plateau 54 meters from McCalloch, according to his notes. Shape: 2 discs stacked horizontally. The upper one was dome-shaped, the lower one flatter. The surface was metallic, smoky gray, without portholes or identifying marks. The object swayed slightly upon landing, then came to a standstill. McCalloch did not run away. He later admitted this without any bravado. "I was simply spellbound. I couldn't move." He stood motionless for about 20 minutes, staring at the craft. Then, when nothing happened, he took his first step forward. He approached cautiously. He took out a notebook and sketched as he went, the general appearance, proportions, and angle of the dome's tilt. He wrote, "The surface is warm. The metal is not steel, not aluminum. Color, like heated silver." At a distance of about 6 meters, he caught a scent. He later described it as follows: "Sulfur, burning sulfur, but not sharp, as if something electrical were burning inside, behind the wall." Then a hatch opened in the object's hull. Not abruptly, smoothly, like the lid of a toolbox. A rectangular opening formed, about 50 centimeters wide and 30 centimeters high. McCalloch then focused separately on one detail. Like a mechanic accustomed to working with tolerances of hundredths of a millimeter, the edges of the hatch were fitted so tightly that when it was closed, I couldn't have slipped a 0.05 millimeter feeler gauge in there. No gaps, no seams. I don't know what tool they used to do it. Light was coming from inside, warm, yellowish golden, and sounds. McCalloch emphasized this particularly. There were sounds. He described them as the sound of voices, not words, but a human register, as if 2 people were speaking in hushed tones in the next room. He stepped right up to the hatch and peered inside. What he saw there, inside, he could not fully describe it, neither then nor later. Light, panels, surfaces. "Like inside an engine room," he said. He shouted into the darkness, first in Polish, "Jest tam ktoś?" Then in English, then in German. No answer. The voices continued to sound, unchanged. Then the object began to turn, slowly, the entire hull rotating around a vertical axis. McCalloch took a step back, but not quickly enough. The ventilation grill on the side of the hull, he hadn't noticed it before, or it had opened during the rotation, ended up right in front of his chest, 20 to 30 centimeters away, and a jet burst out from there. Scorching gas or steam, he couldn't tell for sure. The pressure was intense. His shirt and undershirt burst into flames instantly. He managed to rip them off, more to put out the fire than out of conscious choice. The pain was sharp and immediate. Burn marks remained on the skin of his chest, exactly in the shape of the ventilation grill. 27 dots, 9 columns in 3 rows, each about 15 millimeters in diameter, spaced evenly about 8 millimeters apart. McCalloch fell. Not from pain, from nausea. He described it this way: "I threw up immediately, then again. Then my head felt very light, as if the air had been sucked out of it." The object rose and vanished. That much he still remembered. He heard a growing whistle, then silence. Then darkness. This is where the part of his story begins that all investigators recorded separately, and which no psychiatric diagnosis has fully explained. McCalloch said that he lost and regained consciousness several times. The first time he woke up to a bright light, like a welding flash right in my face. He felt that he was being carried somewhere. They weren't carrying him. They were driving him, steadily, horizontally, with a slight vibration. The smell of sulfur, he said, grew stronger. Not just a background odor, but rich, almost thick, as if he were inside something metallic and heated. He saw nothing but that light. He could feel neither the surface beneath him, nor the fabric, nor the hands holding him. The second time he came to because of the pain. He spoke of it only twice in his entire life, and both times briefly, almost in a rush, as if he himself didn't want to dwell on that episode. A sharp pain from below, as if something metal and large were being thrust inside me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. He lost consciousness again. The third time he woke up, he was outdoors. He was lying on his back. The sky was bright, the same clear May sky. Beneath it, grass and stone. He was in the very same field, right where he had first seen the object. No craft in sight. Silence. His watch read around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. At least 3 hours had passed between the first moment he looked into the hatch and the moment he woke up. To him, it felt like minutes. McCallick walked to the car for about 2 hours. He vomited twice along the way. The pain in his chest was severe but bearable. The burns had already dried out a bit. The pain in his lower abdomen, which he couldn't describe directly, was, in his words, constant and burning. He reached the parking lot, got into the car, and discovered that his Sunto compass was spinning erratically. The needle was circling and refused to settle on any particular direction. This disoriented him more than the pain. A geologist who had navigated these forests by compass for 20 years suddenly didn't know which way to go, even though the highway was just one turn away. He sat in the car for several hours. He couldn't say exactly how long, until the nausea subsided enough for him to get behind the wheel. This, incidentally, is consistent with the geological reality of the area. The Canadian Shield in the vicinity of Falcon Lake contains magnetite deposits, which, at certain points, produce magnetic field anomalies sufficient to deflect the needle. But Michalek's compass had been working normally that morning as he walked toward the plateau, and it was working normally again after he got onto the highway. It was only between those 2 points that it behaved differently. Finally, he started the engine and drove toward Whitehead. 22 minutes into the trip, he began to feel ill again and pulled over to the side of the road. An oncoming driver, an elderly man in a Dodge pickup with out-of-state license plates, stopped and helped drive him to a motel in Whitehead. This was the first witness. He called an ambulance. The doctor on duty at the Whitemouth Hospital, Dr. Hewlett, admitted Michalek at 10 p.m. that same day. He documented burns on his chest, describing them as atypical in shape and nature of exposure, prescribed pain medication, and admitted the patient for the night. The next morning, Michalek asked to call his wife. Maria arrived the next day. In the weeks that followed, Michalek saw doctors 18 times. In Winnipeg, in Toronto, twice at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. The symptoms worsened. Sudden weight loss, 8 kilograms in 3 weeks, chronic headaches, intermittent nausea, burn marks periodically appearing on his abdomen, those very 27 spots that would fade almost to the point of disappearing, then redden and become inflamed again for no apparent reason. Hematologists recorded a decrease in lymphocyte count and changes in the blood count characteristic of non-specific radiation exposure. Such was the wording in one of the reports. Non-specific, because none of the standard types of radiation exposure produced exactly this pattern. The burns on the chest did not fit into any known medical classification. Dermatologist William Liddell of the University of Winnipeg Hospital wrote in his report in June 1967, "The nature of the burns indicates a high-intensity point-source thermal effect with a short exposure time. The geometry of the injury reproduces the pattern of a perforated metal plate. The mechanism is unknown." Liddell had worked in burn surgery for 20 years. He had never seen anything like it. But there was a second finding during the medical examination, the one that official documents from 1967 referred to evasively as a foreign body in the rectal region, an object of unknown origin, or a possible artifact. An X-ray revealed a small, irregularly rounded metal object firmly lodged in the upper rectum. It was not visible from the outside. It did not cause any bleeding. The coloproctologist who examined Michalek, Dr. Robert Trentham of the Mayo Clinic, concluded that the object is not the result of a domestic injury, judging by its location and the condition of the surrounding tissues. An attempt to remove it endoscopically failed. As the instrument was inserted, the object shifted deeper and disappeared from view. A repeat X-ray taken 48 hours later revealed only a faint, translucent trace, a blurred spot in the same area, without clear contours or metallic contrast. The radiologists concluded that the object's density had somehow changed to values virtually indistinguishable from the density of the surrounding soft tissues. It hadn't disappeared. It had become invisible to X-rays. These are two different things, and this second explanation was more frightening than the first. In the end, he wrote "artifact" on the chart and closed it. But he kept a separate page with the description, 2 handwritten sheets, in his personal archive. His heirs found them in 1993 after his death. More on that later. While Michalek was going from doctor to doctor, other people came to see him. The first were officers from the Royal Canadian Air Force, 2 of them, in civilian clothes, from the Winnipeg St. Andrews base. They arrived 4 days after the incident, sat down in the kitchen, and asked for coffee. The conversation lasted 3 hours. They didn't explain anything, they just listened and took notes, neatly, in notebooks, without a voice recorder. Then they left. Michalek never saw them again. They didn't leave him any paperwork. The second group consisted of 2 people from the U.S. National UFO Investigations Agency, NICAP. They had come from Washington specifically for this and brought a photographer with them. They photographed the burns and took samples of the charred fabric from the shirt that Michalek had kept. The fabric was sent to a laboratory in Maryland. The analysis results, radioactive contamination with the isotope radium-226, did not match any known industrial or natural source. But what was particularly important was not the concentration itself, but the isotopic purity. Radium-226 is never found in isolation in nature. It is always accompanied by a whole chain of uranium and thorium decay products, radon, polonium, and lead-210. It is precisely this tail that geologists use to distinguish natural radium from artificial radium. This tail was absent from Michalek's sample. Only radium-226, in its pure form, without the accompanying isotopes that must be present in any natural scenario. The theory that he simply stumbled upon a uranium vein fell apart right here. Nature doesn't work that way. Another thing is noteworthy. On the shirt, the contamination was concentrated precisely in the area of the burn pattern, rather than evenly across the surface. It was as if the radiation was emanating from specific points, from those very 27 holes. Journalists were the third to arrive. Reporter David Belis of the Winnipeg Free Press wrote the first article on May 28, 1967. It appeared on page 6 under a neutral headline, but the next day, the story made it into the Toronto Star, then to the Associated Press, and then to American tabloids. By mid-June, Michalek was receiving 2 or 3 letters a day from all over North America, from UFO researchers, believers, alleged abductees, and television show producers. He did not open most of the letters. The Canadian government, through the Department of National Defence, officially launched an investigation. A team of 3 officers and 2 civilian specialists visited the incident site twice, in June and September 1967. On the Rocky Plateau, they discovered several items that later became the subject of prolonged controversy. First, traces of radioactive contamination on the surface of the rocks. The localized nature of the contamination, measured by a Geiger counter, matched the description of the landing site provided by Michalek. The isotope was the same radium-226 as on the shirt, and, as in the case of the shirt, it lacked the isotopic companions that are characteristic of natural sources. Geologists found no natural sources of isotopically pure radium in this area, neither at that time nor during subsequent surveys. Second, there were signs of thermal damage on the surface of the rock, an area of approximately 5 by 5 meters, where, according to Michalek, the object stood. The lichen on these rocks had been completely scorched. The structure of the granite in the upper layer showed signs of thermal shock, microcracks characteristic of rapid heating to temperatures exceeding 500 degrees Celsius. Third, a ring-shaped groove, approximately 1.5 centimeters deep and 2 centimeters wide, was discovered in the soil around the scorched area. The diameter of the ring was about 4 meters. The nature of this mark was not explained in any official document. The final report of the Canadian Department of National Defence, signed by Colonel Hansen, was dated October 1967 and ran to 47 pages. The conclusion stated, The physical evidence found is consistent with the witness's account. However, we are unable to determine the nature of the phenomenon that could have caused the described damage. It was neither an admission nor a denial. A gray area. An official gray area recorded in a government document. The years passed. McCulloch continued to work at the factory for another 3 years, until 1970, then retired due to health reasons. The headaches did not stop. Burn marks continued to appear and disappear on his skin. This went on for 7 years. A total of 22 doctors examined him. All told, 22. Not a single one could provide a comprehensive explanation for the recurring burns. Of particular note is the record made by dermatologist Stanley Lewis of Toronto in November 1970. Lewis examined McCulloch for the 4th time and noted another flare-up. The reticular burn marks had become inflamed for no apparent reason, despite the fact that the patient had spent the last 3 months in the city without being exposed to any thermal effects. Lewis wrote, "The clinical picture cannot be explained within the framework of known dermatological diseases. The specific geometry of the rashes rules out an infectious or autoimmune nature. The pattern replicates the initial burn injury, which is impossible in the absence of repeated external exposure. In other words, his skin continued to remember what had happened to it in May 1967. To remember and reproduce." In 1972, McCulloch wrote a short book. It was titled My Encounter with a UFO and was published in a small print run in Winnipeg. In it, he recounted exactly what he had told the doctors and officers, word for word, without exaggeration or sensationalism, more like a technical report. The presentation was dry, mechanically precise, with measurements and timestamps. The book circulated quite widely in ufology circles. Among UFO researchers, the McCulloch case became canonical. It was included in lists of the most credible incidents, with references to physical evidence and medical documentation. This was one of the few cases where there was a witness, traces at the scene, medical confirmation, and an official investigation. All 4 components together are a rarity. The skeptical community responded in kind. Robert Finley, a psychiatrist at the University of Manitoba who had never met McCulloch in person, published an article in a medical journal in which he suggested a syndrome of mass psychosis and self-induced psychosomatics. According to Finley, the burns could have been self-inflicted, using a burning metal mesh or a stencil. Radioactive contamination was a result of contact with natural deposits that may not have been detected earlier. The foreign object in the rectum was an X-ray artifact. Ufologists responded specifically to each of these points. Self-inflicting burns with such geometric precision, without a single miss, was deemed by surgeons to be physically impossible through self-inflicted action. The angle at which the burns were inflicted corresponds to a frontal impact from the outside. Radioactive contamination is not the result of natural deposits, since samples from the shirt and the landing site showed isotopically pure radium-226 without the obligatory accompanying isotopes. This is physically impossible in the case of natural origin. The foreign object in the rectum is not an X-ray artifact, since an artifact cannot be round, homogeneous, and show metallic contrast on the first image, and then be translucent on the repeat image taken 2 days later. It was not an equipment malfunction. It was a change in the object itself. The debate continued. McCulloch did not participate in it. He declined interviews in 1975 and has not spoken publicly since. He lived quietly. He went to church. Occasionally, he went to the woods, but not to Falcon Lake. Never again to Falcon Lake. The case seemed to have stalled. It was buried under years of silence, like dust. McCulloch lived until 1999 and died in Winnipeg at the age of 82 from ordinary heart failure with no connection whatsoever to the events of May 1967, at least according to the official version. But the story wasn't over. It was just waiting. In 1993, after Dr. Robert Trentham's death in Rochester, his family was sorting through his archives. Among several thousand sheets, medical records, correspondence with colleagues, lecture notes, they found 2 handwritten pages stapled to an empty medical folder. On the cover was only the date, July 1967, and the initials SM. The sheets contained a description of the X-ray examination, a calculation of the object's location, a preliminary identification of the material, and a phrase that Trent had highlighted. The object is not a medical implant of a known type. The material is a non-radio-opaque alloy of unknown composition. The density is abnormally high for an object of this size. Below, in different handwriting and ink, apparently added later, the patient categorically did not remember how this object could have ended up inside him. His explanation, complete amnesia for the period from the moment of the burns to waking up on the field, is clinically consistent with dissociative amnesia caused by acute trauma. However, dissociative amnesia does not explain the presence of a foreign object. The heirs transferred the sheets to the Canadian UFO archive at the University of Alberta. There they remained for nearly 25 years, in digitized form in a database, virtually unnoticed. The turning point came in 2019. As part of a program to declassify archival materials, the Canadian government transferred the complete set of documents on the McCalloch case to Library and Archives Canada, 47 pages of the main report, and another 83 pages of related correspondence, including internal correspondence from the Department of National Defense and letters sent to the U.S. National Security Agency. This last development was unexpected. It turns out that in October 1967, the Canadian Ministry had officially asked the NSA whether the device described by McCalloch was an American military experimental project. The NSA's response, declassified in 2019, consisted of a single paragraph. The described object does not pertain to any aircraft development programs known to us. We recommend closing the case. We recommend closing the case. Not, we know of nothing. Not, this is not our object. Specifically, we recommend closing it. The declassified materials sparked a new wave of interest. In 2021, a group of independent researchers led by Professor of Geology Thomas Ernest of the University of Winnipeg conducted a new field survey of the incident site. They used ground-penetrating radar and mass spectrometric analysis of soil samples. The results were published in a non-scientific but peer-reviewed journal on anomalistics. The ring-shaped trench discovered in 1967 remained intact. In over 50 years, the soil had not completely filled it in. Samples from the area inside the ring contained an abnormally high concentration of the isotope radium-226, 38 times higher than the background level for this geological region, and again, without the accompanying decay products that would be present in any natural scenario. This fact cast serious doubt on the theory of natural deposits. If such deposits existed, the contamination would have been widespread and isotopically mixed, rather than localized, confined to a ring 4 meters in diameter and isotopically pure. It was then that Michalek's son, Stanislav Michalek Jr., an engineer working in Ottawa, first spoke publicly about what his father had told the family in private conversations. This account was never included in official testimony and was not included in the 1972 book. According to Stanislav, his father repeatedly returned in his recollections to one detail. When he woke up for the second time, at the moment he described as a sharp pain, he felt that he was lying on a flat, warm surface, metallic, horizontal. Above his face, he sensed something, very close, perhaps 20 or 30 centimeters away. He couldn't see what exactly it was. There was no light, or perhaps he couldn't open his eyes. But he could hear. A mechanical sound, he said. Steady, monotonous, like a drill running at low speed, only quieter and softer. Then, darkness again. Stanislav emphasized, his father didn't talk about this in public, not because he was afraid of being ridiculed. He was indifferent to ridicule. He didn't talk about it because he himself didn't know whether it was part of a real experience or a hallucination caused by pain shock. He was a mechanical engineer. He did not trust anything that could not be physically verified. This was, perhaps, the most accurate description of him. However, in the context of documents declassified in 2019, his son's words took on a different dimension. Among the correspondence of the Department of National Defense, a single sheet was discovered. Untitled, unsigned, undated, but sandwiched between two dated letters from the fall of 1967. It was written on letterhead that could not be attributed to any known Canadian agency. The text was brief, consisting of 7 lines. Its content was as follows. The object with which the witness made contact, according to available data, used a biological monitoring probe to collect tissue samples and internal data. This was classified as a procedure for initial contact with an unknown biological species. And further, it is recommended to monitor the subject for the next 2 years to identify physiological changes potentially caused by the collection of biological material. It is unknown who wrote this document. It is unknown whose letterhead it bears. It is unknown whether it belongs to government records or was mistakenly included in the file from an external source. Archivists at Library and Archives Canada classified it as a document of unknown origin requiring further attribution. As of the date of publication of the declassified materials, the attribution work had not been completed. Biological monitoring probe. Combined with what Dr. Trentham discovered at the Mayo Clinic in July 1967, and which vanished without a trace from the X-ray 2 days later, this phrase took on a different meaning than if it had stood alone. The ufology community split into 2 camps, and this division persists to this day. The first camp argues that everything that happened to Michalak was unintentional. He accidentally stumbled upon an object that did not intend to make contact with the local population. The ventilation grill struck him simply because the object was turning, and Michalak happened to be in the wrong place. Everything that followed, medical interventions, collection of biomaterial, probing, was a forced reaction to accidental contact, a sort of quarantine procedure in the event of unauthorized interaction. The other side tells a different story. They point out that the object did not fly away immediately after releasing the gas. According to Michalak's account, several minutes may have passed between the burn and his loss of consciousness. That was enough time to take him away. And they did, and brought him back to the exact same spot. This is no accident. This is a procedure. Regardless of which of these versions one accepts, there remains a fact that does not fit into either. Michalak returned to the very same place. Not on that day, later. In August 1968, 15 months after the incident, he arrived at Falcon Lake alone, without telling anyone. His wife found out about it by chance from an entry in his notebook. What he was doing there is unknown. The notebook for August 1968 is missing. His son says he did not see it among his father's belongings after his death. Maria Michalak, who died in 2011, never spoke publicly about this visit. The only thing that remains is an entry in a travel notebook. Falcon, August 14th, and a few illegible lines, from which only one word can be clearly read. The word is written in Latin script, larger than the rest of the text. The word? Nothing. Nothing. He arrived, and there was nothing there. Or he wrote that word because that was exactly what he wanted to find, precisely to make sure that there was nothing there. That the stone plateau was once again just a stone plateau. That lichen was growing on the black granite again. That the circular groove was overgrown with grass, that life had returned to the state it was in before 10:30 a.m. on May 20th, 1967. Maybe that's exactly what he found. And that gave him something. Peace of mind, or closure, or simply a fact he could keep to himself and not think about. But the burns kept coming back for another 2 years after that trip. The final medical report in the case is dated February 1971. It was written by dermatological surgeon Albert Garner of the Winnipeg Clinic. The report is brief, 1 page. Garner noted that the burn flare-ups had ceased, the scar tissue had stabilized, and the overall condition of the skin was without pathology. Then there is a single sentence at the very end, which he crossed out but not thoroughly enough. It was read during the digitization of the document. The sentence, "The patient asked if the skin could retain information about past injuries at the cellular level. I said I didn't know." Steve Michalak lived another 28 years after that. He worked in the garden. He watched the news on TV. Sometimes he saw something about UFOs on the news and said nothing. His wife said he never watched documentaries on the subject. He'd changed the channel. In 2023, The Canadian Museum of Aviation and Space in Ottawa opened a permanent exhibition dedicated to the Falcon Lake incident. In the display case, a replica of the shirt with burn marks, an X-ray showing an anomalous object, the one from the Mayo Clinic archives, and a map of the Rocky Plateau with a ring marked on it. Next to it hangs an information panel with the text, "The Mikulik case is the only one in Canadian history where an official government investigation confirmed physical evidence of contact with an unidentified flying object, without drawing any conclusions about the nature of that object." No conclusion. That's exactly right. After 22 doctors, 2 military field expeditions, a request to the US NSA, 47 pages of an official report, declassified correspondence between the two countries, and 17 years of medical observation, no conclusion regarding the nature of the object. Perhaps the answer lies in this no conclusion. Perhaps such answers are the most honest of all. When a man who spent 20 years working with metal and knew the difference between precise and approximate comes home with 27 geometrically perfect burns on his chest and cannot explain a single one of them. What happened that morning on the Falcon Lake Stone Plateau? Was it a chance encounter or a planned data collection? Was the object that spent several hours inside him forgotten intentionally? Or was this forgetfulness the only form in which Mikulik's psyche could endure it? And who wrote that unnamed document in the Department of National Defense file, the one with the phrase about a biological monitoring probe? Who knew about this in October 1967, and where from? The plateau by Falcon Lake is still there. The circular trench is there too. The radioactive contamination within its boundaries, according to the 2021 expedition, hasn't gone anywhere. The numbers have only dropped slightly over the past half-century. Stone remembers longer than people do. What do you think actually happened there on the morning of May 20th, 1967?